and welcome to India Narrative. In Open Court today, we are focusing on the evolving geopolitical situations in the context of Russia-Ukraine conflict, its impact on the economies of Russia, Asia, Europe, world at large, and the way forward. To put things into perspective, we are joined by Dr. Anastasia Likhacheva. A very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Most welcome. Our guest today is Dean, Faculty of World Economy and International Affairs with the prestigious HSE University based in Moscow, Russia. Dr. Anastasia, let me begin by asking you about the ever-changing world order. Given that the Russian-Ukraine conflict is into its third month, how do you see the evolving geopolitical situations?
Well, first of all, I see that for Russia, the more the conflict goes, and for the rest of the world as well, especially for the West, it's so much more beyond the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's now the very profound conflict between Russia, the West, and I think that this particular conflict launched lots of processes that probably will reshape the global architecture, not just of politics and military alliances that already is observable, but of global finance and of the whole idea of globalization as we knew it in the 20th century.
So when you say West, is it primarily the US or Europe, any specific nation?
Well, I would say that by just military capacity, definitely it's the United States and NATO alliance, but now it looks like the broader coalition of Western states. It's not only United States and Europe, it's also Canada, Japan. The relations with Tokyo of Moscow recently worsened dramatically, and I can hardly imagine their quick improvement in coming years. So it's not geographical determination, it's more political determination.
And are growing sanctions by the West a concern for Russia?
Well, definitely they are. I always joke that the idea that sanctions are forever is a myth, but the idea that sanctions are not a problem is also the myth. But the concern is quite different that particularly I see in Western media. Of course, some immediate shocks they took place, but by now they look being quite moderated by Russian government, by raised oil and gas prices. But strategic challenges are much more profound, related to technologies, to the very profound call for Russia to structurally change its economy, its foreign relations, its technological priorities. And that's so much more not about sustainability, it's not how to fall, it's about how to develop. And that's a long-term challenge that demands much more from Russian government, from Russian business community, from change of the relations within it.
And given the fact that the conflict started in February, in hindsight, do you believe that the conflict was inevitable or could it have been avoided?
Well, we always say that history doesn't know the if formula. So now we are in the conflict and it doesn't look like a conflict that can be solved very quickly from military terms and will have long implications for humanitarian issues, for people-to-people relations that will last for decades, I guess. But we are there, and Russian government definitely needs to put lots of efforts to refine its strategy in new world, and we're now in a new world, and the 30 period of post-Soviet era is now over for Russia for sure. The question was going to be next.
And do you also sense any palpable apprehension amongst the European neighbors of Russia?
Well, they are quite open and persistent in active pronunciation of these concerns and accusations, but I think that the question of new architecture of European security, it will be on table next day. The active phase of military conflict is over, no matter how it overs. But Russia, United States can't afford to live without any ideas about strategic security because it's just too dangerous.
You mentioned about the implications on the energy supplies. Now, how do you see the entire payment options episode? Because reports suggest that the gas that was given by Russia to, say, countries like Poland or Bulgaria has been stopped or cut because the payment option has to be in the Russian currency ruble.
Well, to be honest, I see particularly here more of the politics than of economics, because Poland can buy Russian gas from Germany that buys it according to new regulation euro on rubles, but Poland doesn't buy it directly from Russia on rubles. So it's much more about political statement than of de facto physical cancellation of Russian gas. With Bulgaria it's more complicated, but still they have an opportunities to buy it from at least some amounts from Turkish pipeline that also comes from Russia. But I see more politics here. But in general, the question of new payment architecture, it will be the particular question of gas payments, or the whole dispute will launch the reshape of payment systems, and many countries, not only directly involved in Russia, US, Russia, EU relations, will try to elaborate some hedging mechanisms. We now see that Saudi Arabia develops the plans to trade with China in national currencies. Russia tries to promote this national currency exchange with other countries. But it's not only about Russia. Russia is a very important player on energy markets, but on global trade in other goods it can be not so important. But other countries see that this risk, the risk of being physically cut off from payment system, the bloody system of world economy is visible, and well, I think that's the question on table for many countries.
Okay. From economic perspective, help us understand the implications of the conflict in Asia.
Well, first of all, Asia, as many other countries now, will face the consequences of the sanctions imposed on Russia and cut value chains on energy markets, on food markets, on fertilizers. And as I know, for example, Russia and India actively work on some ad hoc solutions to add India and other countries in South Asia to overpass this immediate crisis that will happen. The same with China. That's the immediate effect. So we will see more crises, and the whole economy, the whole world economy, macro-regional economy will become much more turbulent. So as a natural consequences, I would expect rising concerns of Asian countries on their sustainability, on their resilience to global shocks caused not only by Russian-Ukrainian conflict, because it's not so linear, yes. And the one crisis would become a catalyst for many others across the region.
Okay, let's talk about Indo-Russia ties now. Both the countries did have historical ties, be it in trade, defense, and over the years now with technology, innovation as well. How do you see this relationship evolving in the backdrop of the conflict?
Well, I would expect that in coming months or year, because of course most of the attention now of Russia is on the Western flank, Russia would suggest more interesting initiatives to India to take a fresh look on the potential of the relations, to suggest some new approaches to joint energy projects, for example, in the Arctic region, to elaborate some sustainable cooperation in food security and food production, in pharmaceuticals, of course. And as for student exchange, I think that we already have lots of Indian students in Russia, but I think that the potential of cooperation is very, as we politically correct, we have lots of potential to develop in our bilateral relations in terms of education.
And you've been to India before. That was in Mumbai, the commercial capital. How was your visit to New Delhi this time?
Well, I truly enjoy the visit despite the complicated political disputes we had at Raisina Dialogue, but it's much better to have complicated political disputes than not to talk to. And what I particularly always appreciate here in Delhi, and I really felt very visible in Mumbai, that so many young people. So the energy of vibrant young population, that's probably what you can easily see if you just go across the streets. And here I see a very rich source for the development of Russian-Indian relations too.
And Prime Minister Narendra Modi talks about self-reliant India or the Atmanirbhar Bharat. How do you see the self-reliance, the capability that India has, not just for its own citizens, but also for the welfare of the global community?
Well, I think that Mr. Modi clearly feels these rising risks of global interdependence, of global asymmetric dependencies especially. And the more countries, especially big countries, countries with first world population like India, can manage their risks on their own, or at least critical risks, the much better it is for regions where they are and for macro regions. Because the more areas, islands of stability, or at least attempts to provide stability, the world will get.
So what could be the other possible areas of collaboration between India and Russia? Could it be space technology? Could it be healthcare as a priority?
Well, definitely. In terms, if I open the list of prioritized technological projects and critical technologies in Russia, pharmaceuticals, healthcare, space, they are all there. But for example, I think that we can also reconsider the traditional areas of cooperation. For example, we have an intense energy dialogue. That's clear. But we don't talk from the frame of green dialogue, of green priorities, climate change, and Russia and India can develop lots of issues in this field, because both for Russia with our melting permafrost and for India with its booming population that needs energy. The question of climate change, the question of energy transition, it's not just the question of future generations. Yes. We have generations living right here, right now, that have very profound needs. And from this perspective, Russia, India, Central Asian countries, China, Southeast Asian countries, we have quite a different angle in this global problem. So I think some green dialogue in this field, including, of course, energy cooperation, it would be very, very on demand, because climate won't wait till we finalize all our political.
Yes, well, we all have one common address, and which is planet Earth. But in addition to the bilateral relations, let's talk about multilateralism. What is Russia's view when you have different regional groupings, whether BRICS, where both Russia and India are partners, or say Quad, or RCEP, or European Union? What's your take on multilateralism?
Well, Russian officials clearly say that BRICS, SCO, Eurasian Economic Union, Greater Eurasian Framework are prioritized projects. With some multilateral formats, we now clearly have profound problems. Let's call it like this, like with European Union. Basically, when some format imposes sanctions on you, it's very hard to cooperate actively. But I think that some of the projects we already have, they really need some reassessment. What we did, many things, for example, in BRICS we did greatly. We have a bank that supports real projects in renewable energy, in infrastructure. That's fantastic that we have it. We have a sustainable platform for many people to talk, to keep contacts. Great. But in coming years, countries will be much more egoistic in a good sense of this word, or taking care of their self-reliance, in other words. And just to meet 2 times a year or 1 time a year to say that we would love to cooperate, it becomes too extreme luxury. So we need, Russia needs to suggest to their partners, particularly to India, to other partners in BRICS, to China, to South Africa, Brazil, where we concentrate our efforts. I see 3 fields. First, financial sustainability, or at least hedging of financial risks. So it can be payment systems, it can be a question of digital currencies, and India made lots of progress in it. So I think that this kind of dialogue is, well, we need it yesterday, but maybe after tomorrow. Second, the question of insurance mechanism, global insurance mechanisms, because what we see now, even if it's a particular case of bilateral sanctions like US or EU against Russia or vice versa, the global insurance market, mostly located in London, and incoming conflicts, for example, or incoming multiplication of sanctions with China, secondary sanctions over other countries, the question of insurances will be there. And for a country like India that is involved in global trade and global logistics so actively, that also I hope can be on demand. And third, technological cooperation, standards, certification, parallel certification that is needed.
Because per the Finance Act 2022 this year, India has introduced the virtual digital asset and currency. So even Russia is a leader when it comes to, say, the payment architecture with digital platforms?
Well, that's a bit two different issues. To my estimations, Indian progress in digital currency is deeper. So Russia also has an initiative of digital ruble, but it's always a question not just what you do, but to whom you talk to. And here, the digital aspect, I think, is very important, both for hedging some particular sanction risks, but also just to make the cooperation easier. For example, Russia and India, we have an account to trade in national currency since, I don't know, 1970s or something. But it was initially constructed to deal with relatively small amount of deals. If we want to multiply cooperations that Russian medium and small and medium enterprise or Indian small and medium enterprise worked it directly, not just every time talking to Prime Minister or the President of the Russian Federation, we need easier and very intuitive system for them to do it.
Okay, and let's talk about the soft power. Films, sports, they are the soft power. There was a time when Indian films and some of the film stars like Raj Kapoor were very famous in Russia. How's the emerging scenario now?
Well, I think that here, now we have some part of relatively objective problems regarding the problems of global platforms working in Russia, but it's possible. In general, we made a very interesting research during the pandemic about the booming demand in terms of requests in Google from, for example, countries like Russia, France, Italy, to a request for cultural media production from Asian countries. And we saw, for example, like in France, in 2 months, the demand for Indian shows quadrupled. So now it's very non-linear. I think that a small effort here could, due to these online platforms and that people get used to these formats, now it can make this cooperation much easier. Plus traveling. We need more people-to-people relations because during the pandemic, it heavily cut the understanding about the others.
So you're an economist and you're a teacher too. So if the students of today and the coming generation would like to know, why was it necessary for Russia to have these special military operations that they commenced on the 24th of February? How would you sum this up for them?
Well, I would recommend them to read archives and textbooks starting much earlier than 24 of February, because any attempt to understand it right here, it would cut them into other mental, cognitive questions. So it all started much earlier, and the design of this solution, the way how they were the way how these solutions were elaborated, I think that it will be a very important question for scholars in many countries for the coming decades, because it will be the starting point for many processes we will see in the world, in many regions, in many areas.
So in one line, it could well be protecting your nation's security. It is about your sovereignty of a nation.
Well, in one word, that's what President Putin said many times, that's about sovereignty. But then the big question, how countries understand sovereignty, what makes their understanding about the threats, that's what we have to study very carefully.
Now, there were reports also about the excesses that were done in the conflict, satellite images of the Bucha as well. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's very hard for me to respond to that exactly. What I can say about the information and the manipulation of information we definitely see. I think that first we had it during the pandemic when we had a reality show on how people die 24/7 in every messenger, and now we have a 24/7 online representation of war. What I clearly see is that human brain wasn't fitted to that, and it definitely is another aspect that military experts of the future will study very carefully, I think.
But do you think humanity has the power to be its own savior? Or as some say, that this could well escalate into World War III? Would that be a possibility?
Well, I think that the risks of heavy escalation now are higher than any time since last 30 years for sure, and maybe even longer. For Russian authorities and for Western authorities, this situation is much more quickly evolving from Russian-Ukrainian conflict to proxy war of the Western states against Russia at the Ukrainian territory, or vice versa, as they see of Russian aggression against the West on the Ukrainian territory. And it creates extremely high risks because this proxy war has much more chances than any previous one to turn from proxy to a real war. And I'm very concerned about this. The risks are really high.
And India always encourages diplomacy and dialogue. So can we expect that the stakeholders could well take that route of diplomacy and dialogue?
Well, what is paradoxical that everyone understands that sooner or later the diplomatic path will be in the room, and that the whole new period of world history will start from new agreement. The amount of stakeholders of this agreement, that's the question, and the timing of this agreement is the question. But I'm sure, well, there is no other way except the deadly Third World War that diplomacy will be there.
And amongst all this, what role do you see of the United Nations?
Well, nowadays many people blame United Nations, both in Russia and the West, across all over the world. The very adequate argument is that there is nothing better, and there are many problems in the world that also has to be shaken. But United Nations is the product of Second World War, and they represented how major powers of that time saw international order and how they agreed between each other to deal with each other. Now major powers have no agreement at all how they deal with each other. That makes the whole institution fitted for the previous format dysfunctional. When great powers or other major stakeholders, but first great powers agree what do they expect from each other, which limitations they can take on them, the UN can become much more suitable, or some new formats will be elaborated. It's not about titles. The headquarters in New York is a fascinating building, and many diplomats working there, or in Geneva, they love their working place, and they are really very passionate about the mission. But it's a structural problem. It's not a bureaucratic problem.
On the 26th of April 2022, we did see the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, visit Moscow, where we had a joint press conference with him and the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, and then he met President Putin as well. Do you welcome that?
Well, for sure. I think that, of course, not all the questions now can be solved diplomatically. That's obvious for every state, for every person who just follows the news. But even these efforts, even if they are not absolutely sufficient, they still do provide some elements of even not the dialogue, but an opportunity to create some new solutions, some new tracks, to hedge some very important risks, because besides direct Russian-Ukrainian conflict, if next day we find ourselves in open military Russian-NATO conflict, it will be much worse. And I'm sure that Secretary January also understands these risks. And other conflicts all across the world, usually, unfortunately, when great powers are busy with other stuff, they also become more active. So the risks are very high.
Can we have new mechanisms that could foster trade relations and foster ties?
Well, first of all, I profoundly believe that the period when countries could spend 10 or 15 years for negotiations or FTAs, they are passing out. They can simulate negotiations, but it's another kind of political task. Second, trade as we knew it also evolving, and the balance between electronic commerce, between digital goods, between data exchange, it also should be incorporated if we do really want to speak about modern agreements, not just the way how to facilitate trade in goods and maybe services, because services now are also very cross-border and very digital. So that's a very big task, but I do believe that previous regulation of trade as We knew it, the WTO dogmate. It also will evolve, also particularly because of the unprecedented amount of trade sanctions, trade bans, embargoes that we now see with Russia. We already have it with China, and I have no any clue why we will see less in coming years. In this case, in this situation, the previous system becomes in many aspects dysfunctional.
Right. Well, let's hope lessons from the history are learned for a brighter future. As I said, all of us have got the same address, planet Earth, and humanity comes out to be a savior for itself. Dr. Anastasia, it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining us on India Narrative.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the listeners.
Thank you.